Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. My name is Ahmed Moor and I'm a fellow at the Foundation. Today is November 25th, 2025, and I am very, very happy to be here with Tareq Baconi.
It's good to
Tareq,
be here.
welcome.
Thank you.
Uh, Tareq is a Palestinian writer and scholar. He's the author of Hamas Contained, a study of Palestinian resistance movements, and I hope we'll have time to talk about Hamas and what's happening now in Palestine. But our primary purpose is to talk about your new book, Fire in Every Direction, which I was just telling you I read in a day. Impossible to put down. A fantastic book, but not an easy book. Um, it's not an easy book. I expected to be a part of the chorus. I expected to read the book and kind of know what was in it in advance.
Mm,
I But it's subversive. It's a
mm,
subversive book in that it's written about the Arab world, and it reflects a lot of it critically reflects a lot of the ingrained social mores of the Arab world. But there's a lot of kind of queer material in there. It's a coming of age story in a way that I think reflects a truth that may be felt by a kid in the American Midwest if they read this book. And so I say it's subversive because you brought together, I read the book because Tareq Baconi is a sharp analyst and he's an activist on Palestine. I'm going to read anything he writes. But it's also, again, a book that may be at home in a queer literature section. And so I was exposed to material that I otherwise wouldn't have been exposed to. As a man who comes from a particular background of a particular age. And And what you've achieved here is you made me uncomfortable and unsettled at times with some of the writing, frankly. And I was exposed to something I wouldn't have otherwise been exposed to. And then in the other direction, somebody who's reading it really because of its value as a memoir and a queer memoir may be exposed to some radical Palestine ideas, particularly at the end. Was that kind of, I guess, alchemy? Was that a deliberate effort on your part? What were you thinking? Who was the audience? And was it your goal to make people like me uncomfortable in a positive way? But it made me uncomfortable.
well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to the podcast and thank you for reading the book and for your words. I don't think my I don't think my intention was necessarily consciously to make people uncomfortable, whether on Palestine or on queerness, because I wasn't really thinking about the writing in that way. I was thinking about writing a book that was authentic to my experience as a queer Palestinian who was born and raised in Amman, and grew up between Amman and Beirut. And so I wasn't really thinking about the audience in that expansive sense. I had a very particular audience in mind, and that's very much the person. So for your listeners who might not be aware of what the book is, at its core, this is a book about a friendship and a love story between two boys in Amman. Me being one of the boys, and the other is called Ramzi. And so Ramzi was my singular audience. I was really thinking of him as the reader of the book. And so my effort was less about sort of thinking about these wider audiences, what they might take, how they might be comfortable or uncomfortable with the narrative, and more actually with how I might portray to Ramzi an authentic experience that I felt I was unable to portray when I was a child in Amman, when I didn't quite have the language or the capacity or the self-awareness to be able to describe to him what I was feeling and how our friendship was evolving, how I was growing to recognition of myself as a queer man. And so that was really the intention of the book, sort of speaking to Ramzi everything that I couldn't quite say in my childhood.
Okay. You also indicated that you wanted to have the book written, I'm sorry, translated into Arabic. I mean, you know as well as anybody, and for listeners, the Arab world, I was telling you, I lived in Amman for 8 years continuously up until 5 years ago. So my experience of Amman is as an adult. I have very warm feelings for Amman. It is, as you've written in the book, a place of Palestinian culture, a place of Arabic culture, which is authentic to itself. And all of those things are rendered in rich detail, really beautifully in the book. I imagine that in translation, or even in English, because people read widely in English there, You're going to cause some ripples with the openness with which you talk about the queer identity, being a gay child, being a gay man. Have you, now that you have a little bit of distance, I mean, the book's been published, have you thought about what the reception may be and what your goals around it may be? I mean, it's an intensely socially disruptive book.
Yeah, well, I mean, in some ways, it's interesting to me because there's a lot. Well, at the core of this book is an effort to disrupt silences. I think again that wasn't necessarily my intention, but in wanting to speak to Ramzi, in wanting to talk to Ramzi about everything I couldn't speak about when I was younger, I was grappling with silence. I was grappling with what it means to live in a region or in a social milieu where certain things are left unspoken. And I think Amman is a particular place, but it has this commonality with the rest of the region, which is that there might be a growing awareness of the queer movement, the LGBTQ plus movement, but the discomfort rests not necessarily just in the movement, but actually in whether the movement asserts itself, whether the movement is spoken in what it is, if queer individuals identify as queer. The problem isn't necessarily that they're queer, it's that they are openly queer or want to have relationships or want to be able to narrate their experiences. And so it's that silence that I find oppressive, this sort of sense that you're tolerated as long as you don't talk about it. And so I think I agree with you. I think the issue isn't necessarily the fact that this is that someone like me is a queer individual coming from the region. The issue is that I'm talking about it and talking about it publicly, and even more so, talking about it in English. And we can talk about, that positionality and what it means for me to write this book in English as versus Arabic, which is my first language. Again, going back to the questions of audience, but so I think that the disruption is there. And I think it's a productive disruption in a way because certainly for the queer movement, there's often the sense that the homophobic rhetoric is that queerness is foreign. It doesn't quite exist in the region. It's being transplanted into the region by external interests. And I think by being someone who's very active on Palestine, who's organizing on Palestine, who understands my politics as indigenous to the region, and who is also trying to reclaim an indigenous queerness, a queerness that is not necessarily imposed into the region from the outside, but is homegrown, as it were. I think it's disruptive to how many people question or think about queerness. And I think that's a productive conversation to be had. I think it is being had already. I think certainly so this book, by recounting my childhood, is situated in Amman of the 80s and the 90s. We're in a different Amman today. And I think these conversations are being had in good ways and in bad. And I think this book just adds to that.
Yeah. I want to focus on the idea of Palestine as a lever and as a key. So I grew up in an Islamic or kind of fairly conservative Muslim household, and my parents were disappointed for some time about my relative lack of religious commitment today. But because I'm good on Palestine, they've made their peace with it, and it's all good. Um, is there an element of that around queerness as well? You talk about queer indigeneity in your own politics as really an activist. Are you able to act as a wedge on this topic because you're so good on Palestine and Palestine is so dear and important?
That's such a perceptive question, and I'm really glad you asked it. I think so. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that in some ways my work on Palestine and the fact that I'm so committed to this struggle has meant that people have turned a blind eye to things that they might not care to admit or witness. And I think in some ways, it gives a degree of social loyalty. It gives a degree of social commitment. You're sort of seen as someone who has the best interest of your people at heart. So, whether in your case you're not as religious as your parents want you to be, or in my case, I'm not as straight as my parents or other people might have wanted me to be, there's a blind eye that's turned to the fact that, you're committed to Palestine and the struggle precedes everything. And so, yes, absolutely. I think the commitment to Palestine in some ways elides the queerness. And um, the decision on my part to say actually that's not necessarily a productive illusion. We if we're fighting for Palestine and we're thinking about liberation in a more holistic way, in a way that carries all of our values, all of our people, whether you're queer or not, whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're Christian or Muslim. And so I think decentering, still placing everything within a commitment to Palestinian liberation, of course, but decentering that idea that certain values are more important than others, I think is really important. I think that's a productive thing to do. Forget queerness. If you think about feminism, or if you think about the rights of other minorities, or if you think about race within the context of liberation struggles, often some of these differences get elided in the focus for the struggle, and that's not necessarily a sort of an intersectional approach to liberation. And I think that's what we need, especially when we're talking about Palestine.
And I'd like to get to that theme, the disrupted evolution of a normal society through occupation, apartheid, and now genocide. But before I do, I want to get to a theme which is kind of a big current through the book, and it's inferiority complexes and self-hate at the individual, at the personal level, but also kind of an antipathy for the society, which is inferior in so many ways. And I say that without qualification. And you've really you got to live there, and you've got to read the book also to understand. But so this is page 94. You have you're describing your mother's first visit to Palestine, and she's conveying her experience to her own mother. From the day I went into the embassy here to get my visa, the whole experience has been demeaning. I can now tell you the truth. It has all been humiliating. That I would have needed their permission to go to my home, such arrogance. And even while there, feeling their gaze on me, seeing what they have done with the place, it pained me. We would have never been able to do that. They know what these lands, our lands, are worth. Look at what we've done to Beirut. If Haifa had stayed with us, we would have destroyed her too. But then I don't know. It's all there, but it's all gone. It's beautiful. It really is. It's just not the Palestine we know anymore. And there's so much embedded within this passage. I lived in Beirut for a time in 2008, 2009, and I remember a friend of mine, Haneen, whose father was a diplomat and at that time was teaching at AUB. And so she'd lived in Jerusalem, she'd lived in 48, Palestine, Israel. And she confessed to me that it was so much nicer than Beirut. So much there's landscaping, there's investment in public infrastructure, the water flows continuously. Now, there are lots of reasons for that. When you learn about history, when you learn about the way that development goes and the endless stream of U.S. money to Israel, there are reasons for that. But absent that deep grounding in knowledge, you're encumbered by an inferiority complex. Can you talk about that a little bit? That runs
Absolutely.
through this book.
Absolutely. You're right. It does run through the book, and the inspiration for it, at least textually, comes from Arab Identity, Samir Qasir's book, he's a Lebanese journalist who wrote a book in which he coined the term the Arab malaise, this sense of always being lacking, always being inferior. And you're absolutely right to trace that to a history of colonization and imperial invasion in the region, which leaves certainly the population of this region coming out of this period of whatever their heyday, their golden era was, into this period where they become the playground for foreign occupiers and foreign powers. And I think there is an inferiority complex. That passage that you read was a deeply um, a difficult passage to write, because it's easy to sort of look at that and say, oh, they hate on Palestine or they don't want return. When actually, when you read the whole book, you understand, in this case, my mother's commitment to Palestine and this sense of commitment to the struggle and of desiring return. So both of these things coexist. This sense that, oh, actually, Palestine is ours. We have to reclaim it. These are our lands. And at the same time, struggling with a sense of self-loathing and sort of self-hate and inferiority because of the product of everything that we've talked about, this history of colonialism, but a reality of also authoritarianism and corruption in the region, where these regimes are not necessarily serving their people or these lands. And so there ends up being this self-defeating narrative. And the passage you read is not the only passage in the book. There are other passages where there are, I'm in London and I overhear people look at the streets in London and say, how beautiful or tidy they are compared to us back home. And the tourist describes us as Bajam, as sort of wild animals, people who are not able to take care of themselves. And I think in some ways this is, well, I want to say two things about this. One is it is in conversation with the self-loathing that many queer people have, this sense of shame that they're not quite good enough, they're not able to be what is expected of them. Again, not something that was intentional necessarily, but I do think there's something around queerness and this question that is really important to what is this shame? Where does it come from? What is it a result of, and what does it mean to grapple with this shame? But on the other hand, I think this is also a conversation that is a really important one in the region. What does it mean for people in the region to resuscitate their pride, our pride in who we are, our history, and be committed to knowing that we can do better? That it's not that these imperial powers are better than us, but as you say, structurally, they're coming in with more money, with more capacity. In the Israeli case, it's really an extension of American empire. So we're really dealing with the U.S. on Palestinian soil. What does it mean for us to sort of confront this inferiority complex? And this was Samir Qasir's entire book project. What does it mean for us to really grapple with the fact that we are on every sort of socioeconomic indicator, not as good as we can be? Why is that? And why our regimes comfortable in maintaining their oppressive structures rather than dealing with, providing the citizens of these areas with what they deserve, which is, a dignified life?
So, on the theme of development, I mean social development, infrastructure is its own thing, but social development, I'll say it, the Arab world is backwards, backward. And I brought it up with Noura Erakat when I interviewed her, I think in February of this year. What has happened to our social development when evaluated through the prism of colonialism? When we can't talk about gay liberation because, and you use these words in conversation with Noura, because of the um, Gay International, I think, and it's a concept that sounds like a skit from SNL, but it means something, and I'll ask you to define it. But when we can't talk about being liberated as queer people, as women, as non-religious people, or as religious people in as a pluralistic society, has our development been interrupted by colonialism, and how do we reclaim that? You used the word indigeneity earlier. Why this emphasis on indigeneity? Is it necessary to say, I'm gay, live with it?
I think that this is part of the disruption that we started this conversation with. I think what this book is trying to do is to say, you can't exist in these silences and ignore all of these important conversations that are fundamental to a healthy and vibrant society and social life and social contract between people, in order to sustain the illusion of either a past greatness or an aspiration to a free Palestine. I mean, I think there's something that happens in which we restrict some of the conversations that we want to have and we should be having. We don't talk about women's rights. We don't talk about gay liberation. We don't talk about the fact that there's endemic poverty and people don't have enough to eat, because we cannot be political in this way, or we cannot rock that boat, or there are more important things to look forward to, like sort of commitment to Palestine. I mean, there are variations of this social repressiveness in different countries in the region. Obviously, not only in the region, we're talking about the region, but this manifests differently in Egypt, let's say, than it does in Saudi Arabia, than it does in Jordan. But I think there are similar commonalities. This idea that these regimes come into power, they're authoritarian regimes, they're not democratic, they don't necessarily have a social contract with their citizens that's focused on allowing them to live the full breadth of their lives. And there are different ways in which certain conversations are shut down either by an emphasis on religion or by an emphasis on conservative social norms or by an emphasis on, I deal with this a lot in the book with this concept of aib, that these are things that we don't talk about, we don't extend. And, one of the things that I grapple within the book is who are these silences serving? Why can't we be having these conversations? What would it mean for us to have these conversations and still be committed to a politics that is, emancipatory. In the case of Palestine, I don't see these conversations as being a deflection or a detraction from a commitment to struggle. I see it as being actually part of empowering us so that we're able to struggle more effectively and with more sort of commitment and dedication to our people. And so I think this is, you say that the region is backward. I don't use this terminology because I understand what you're saying, but I do think that it's all context dependent. It's all geographic and temporally dependent on all of these factors. But I think the kinds of disruptions that are forcing conversations to be had, whether from women activists or people wanting gender equality in the region, to queer liberation, to people talking about the role of religion in society, all of these conversations are not signs of weakness. They're signs of strength, and we should be having them.
Fair, and I accept the criticism of the use of the word backward. I should probably use more politic language, but I stand by the assertion. But again, I wonder if in an alternate history, whether we may have had these conversations earlier, whether
Mm,
some of the malaise which afflicts the Arab world, so you talk about the Iraq War in the book. If George Bush and Dick Cheney and Tony Blair hadn't destroyed that country in 2003, would we have seen a different outcome for Iraq in 2011? And that's
mhm,
near-term history.
mhm.
Um, Palestinian queerness. If we didn't have to contend with the overwhelming violence of occupation apartheid, which requires so much energy, um, would we have had these conversations earlier? And that's really what I mean about the arrested development, the disruptions to development. And it's almost, I mean, it's useful to think about but obviously you can't relive history. Where are these conversations happening productively in the region, to your knowledge?
Yeah, but it's really important. You're raising a very important point. I think this is the right way to think about it. How have these foreign powers and these occupations, these invasions that are on our lands, disrupted our ability to have certain conversations and reshaped our social cohesion, reshaped our social structures, enabled certain forms of silences, of conservatism, of religiosity, not necessarily in negative terms, some in positive ways, but just in terms of religion, how people sort of turn to faith to deal with these massive waves of history that they have no control over. So all of this foreign intervention has shaped us and reshaped us and continues to shape us. And I understand sometimes where this fear of opening up to certain conversations comes from. If you're living in Gaza today, and even if you're not in Gaza in the face of, if you're living in the West Bank, where the Nakba is continuing in its own pace, there are more existential questions than necessarily thinking about queer rights or even women's rights. I understand where some of the impulse to focus on survival in the face of such horror comes from. It's in some ways a necessity to marginalize certain conversations and focus on quote unquote more important nationalistic or collective rights. And so I understand how this interplay between foreign invasion and a domestic or indigenous need for survival shapes social contracts and makes some conversations less important or less urgent than others. And I think one of the sort of commitments that I have as an activist in struggle, and I think this is one that's not only mine, that's certainly shared by other communities in the region, is to say actually, yes, of course we're in survival mode. Of course there are important nationalistic struggles that we are engaged in. And in order to be more effective in struggle, we need to be able to have these conversations. And this kind of prioritization, let's say, is not exceptional or unique to Palestine. If you think about the South African struggle for liberation, they almost split up over the question of queer rights, with people in struggle arguing that this is a deflection from the goal to end apartheid, and others saying that you cannot separate the rights of women or queer folks from the struggle to end apartheid. And so I think it's that kind of how do you engage with the prioritization? How do you engage with a sense of urgency? I think these are all healthy and normal questions to be had. And I think that there are movements in the region that are dealing with this, specifically in Palestine, if you think of organizations like Al Qaus, which are basically saying our commitment to queer people first and foremost is dismantling Israeli apartheid. We don't talk about queer rights within the context of apartheid. We talk about queer rights within the context of dismantling apartheid. So they're sort of giving the queer movement this language of saying, to assert one's queerness, it has to exist within this broader structure of decoloniality, of dismantling these regimes of power and coming back to a politics that represents our people.
I appreciate that. The Gay International. Again, it's a funny to me. It's just endlessly. I think there's a lot of comedic opportunity around those words. Can you define what the Gay International is? And it goes concretely to what we were just talking about, the disruption of a conversation because it's wielded as a critique against queer people who are indigenous.
Yes, so the Gay International, sorry, is a seminal concept that was introduced by a professor at Columbia University, Joseph Massad, who wrote a seminal book called Desiring Arabs. And it's a very important book that tries to understand and reflect on what does indigenous sexuality or gender relations look like in the region. And the book really critiques what he calls the Gay International, which is this language of the LGBTQ plus that Western liberal human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch employ in order to sort of say that they're committed to queer liberation elsewhere in the region and how, or in the globe, really, and how that language gets co-opted by structures of power like the US, like the EU, like other sort of largely
APAC.
Western states, APAC, of course, in the Israeli case, pinkwashing, how this language gets co-opted in order to justify foreign invasion and occupation. So, this language gets used to say, for example, Afghanistan, it's backward, it's uncivilized, they don't have gay rights. We want to come in and promote gay rights in the region. And so it becomes a vehicle for empire, really. It becomes a vehicle for destroying indigenous social infrastructure and social ecosystems, not just social, obviously economic and political, but we're focusing on this LGBTQ plus discourse, and becomes sort of the vehicle with which these foreign powers come in and justify their invasions, which are then deemed as civilized or more humanistic because they're bringing the civilizing mission into these spaces. And so the queer communities often get stuck. I mean, not only queer communities, also women in the case of Afghanistan, also in the case of Iraq, the sort of civilizing mission of liberating the Muslim woman specifically. But queer folks get stuck in that discourse where they are then co-opted by these imperial forces as justification for their civilizing mission and to sort of separate who is a barbarian from who is civilized. And we see this very effectively, unfortunately, and very destructively in the case of Israeli colonialism, where this language of pinkwashing said, Tel Aviv and Israel, they're progressive on queer rights. This is the bastion of the LGBTQ plus community globally. Palestinians, queer people get thrown off roofs. And sort of all of this language deflects from the fact that Israel is a colonial regime, and that whether you're queer or straight, whether you're able-bodied or not, whether you're a man or a woman, you're still, as a Palestinian, oppressed and colonized under Israeli apartheid. But that completely gets removed from the conversation, and the focus then gets placed on queerness. If Israel is progressive towards queer issues, obviously only for Jews, then it's a civilized state and Palestinians are uncivilized. And that becomes part of the narrative that reinforces colonialism or justifies colonialism.
And it's used domestically also by indigenous actors, by local actors to disrupt conversations about queerness by saying this is all in service of some foreign scheme to exercise control or whatever it may be.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, some of the language around the Gay International, and that's me being critical of some of the ways in which that language is used by academics and scholars is basically it's a language that in some ways inadvertently reinforces local homophobia. So local homophobes would say, actually, yes, these things do not exist here. This is all a foreign concept that's imposed here. And this makes it difficult for someone like me, for example, to have grown up asserting that I'm a gay man, because that would have immediately sort of put me in the crosshairs of then somehow being a hapless victim of this gay international. And so I think the work of the queer movement is walking that fine line, is trying to say, actually, there is indigenous same-sex relations here. There is indigenous fluidity in gender identity here. And that's not something that means we've accepted to be co-opted into the Human Rights Watch's discourse of the world. We are actually committed to liberation as we understand it to Palestine.
That question of rootedness, that question of, again, indigeneity. There's a point in the book where your father tells you, um, leave, basically. You can't build a life here. You can't build a life in Amman, which is not occupied by Israel, which is a modern place in lots of ways. Um, what is that related to? What is that conservatism related to? That idea of aib? And then how is that tied up? It goes beyond the regime, or at least I'm claiming it goes beyond the regime. It goes beyond ideas of democracy and participatory government. This is a deep cultural architecture. Will you describe your experience living through that culture as well, and then really having to go to physically go somewhere else in order to sort out and begin to identify differently?
Absolutely. I mean, it was a culture of silence. I think this is going back to your first question. What's the motivation for this book? In some ways, the motivation is to break through that silence. So, growing up as a queer boy in Amman, I really had no frames of reference. I really had no ways of understanding what I was. And this is, you have to remember, this is Amman pre-internet, right? This is Amman in the 90s. So, if we think Amman is conservative today, it was much smaller and much more conservative in the 90s. And so, there's really no way for me to grapple with what it was that I was experiencing emotionally as someone who was growing up, who was aware that they had attraction to sort of same-sex attraction at a young age, that I was unable to hold that and I was unable to reconcile with it, and I found that silence oppressive. And in some ways, I found that silence judgmental, and it was a silence that I felt excised me from the community. Um, and as you say, I ended up leaving. I ended up thinking that I could find a sense of belonging and a sense of acceptance elsewhere, as it were for me in London, as a place that was and is sort of seen as cosmopolitan, liberal, open. And I sort of adopted a very liberal discourse. I really drank the Kool-Aid in terms of accepting Western liberalism as something that in which I could belong and in which I could make a home and in which someone like me could be accepted. But that barely lasted a minute. It wasn't long before 2003 happened, and I understood the hypocrisies in the heart of liberalism. I understood what we were just talking about now in terms of how some of these human rights in liberal contexts are co-opted actually in order to maintain imperialism and maintain colonialism in other guises. And so I think that's when I really began to understand that it's not a question of East-West. It's not really a question of fleeing the region and making a home in the West where there's human rights and everything is accepted. It's actually about going back to the region politically and emotionally and grappling with the tensions that you just so beautifully laid out in terms of these conservative societies. Why do we hold on to certain values if they are oppressive? What are we trying to achieve? Is there a way for us to maintain our values to the region, our political values and our social values, and at the same time embrace difference, be able to explore, the rights of individuals or communities in ways that might appear disruptive but are actually fundamentally productive. So I think that's what I'm attracted to, this idea of, we started talking a bit about this idea of malaise, this inferiority complex. What does it mean? What is it stopping us from talking about? What are the conversations we should be having? This conversation between you and I This conversation wouldn't have happened if I hadn't written a book about queerness. Why? There's not, we're both committed to struggle. We have similar values in terms of thinking about liberation. The movement is broad enough to hold both of us. Why are we scared of having some of these conversations? And could it be productive to have these conversations on a communal level?
Yeah, and again, that goes to the disruptive and provocative nature of the book, and I'm grateful to you for having written it. Um, you're teaching me that I can still grow as a person. And I say that as somebody
We're
who's
all growing
deeply,
as a person, as persons.
and I'm deeply embedded in a queer community, but you just don't know what you don't know until you read about it and you go, wait, this is making me uncomfortable. Why is it making me uncomfortable?
Well, why did it make you uncomfortable?
I'm a 41-year-old straight man, and I read a lot of history, I read a lot of politics, I read a lot of cowboy novels and adventure novels and stuff that you may roll your eyes at.
I
When
don't. My brothers are like that.
exactly you were opting out of the Sega games in the early 90s in the book, and that was me, you know? Um, and so I've just never picked up a book that talks about the inner life and the fantasies and the queer fantasies of a little gay boy. And so reading those passages, those erotic fantasies, it's not something I've been exposed to before. And and it just shows the limits, there's being an ally, there's being a good friend to gay people, but you don't really know, you can't really imagine. You need the exposure. And that's the value, I think, also of exposure. Um, but concretely, that's what it is,
And listen, I think there's something very powerful. I think this is why memoir is such a powerful genre because it reflects the inner lives of people. And so you're able to be transported into this world that you don't necessarily understand as intimately, or that
Exactly.
one doesn't necessarily understand.
And that's the key word, intimately, Now I want to challenge you. I want to make it a little bit difficult for you. For people who have lived in Amman, they understand the East-West divide. You talk about Buxat. I spent a lot of time at Buxat. I really enjoy. I used to live out Dawar al-Awwal. Used to hang out a lot at Buxat, and you have this beautiful view over East Amman, and it's really refugee camps. Um, you, in the book, come across, you describe yourself as middle class, but in the context of an upper middle income country, forgive me, and I hope you'll dispute anything I'm saying which sounds wrong, but really wealthy. Lived first in Abdali and then Abdoun, members of the Royal Automobile Club, tennis and swimming pools. That is not the average experience of a person in Amman. And you talk about going to McDonald's when it first opened up. And I have friends in Jordan who talk to me about how seminal that event was for them. But this is a small sliver of society. The price of a Big Mac in an upper middle income country is unattainable for most people. Not only is it unattainable, the street, that neighborhood is impenetrable. Um, so class differences are glaring for me in the book. They just, you have this really conflicted adolescence, but you're driving around. A friend owns a car, Ramsey owns a car. You have disposable income, it sounds like. This is not the average experience of the kid who's working, late night at the shawarma stand that you and your friends may be visiting. So, so the class differences. I mean, I know as a sophisticated intellectual and an academic and a writer, you know them deeply. They don't come across in the book. Why is that?
Well, because it's a book about my experience. It's not a book about every Jordanian's experience. This was the life that I had. I mean, my relationship with class is a complicated one because my parents, by the time they landed in Amman, well, first of all, my grandparents, when they fled Palestine to Lebanon, they were really struggling. I mean, my father went to school at an UNRWA school, and he had to go into university on scholarship, so very much lower income. Certainly on my father's side, my mother's side were more intellectually sort of secure in their professions. They were school teachers, so I'd say lower middle class. But by the time they landed in Amman, they landed with the bare minimum. So very much, at least for my parents, when they started their family and their joint life in Amman, I wouldn't put us in middle income. I would certainly put us in lower income. With the key difference that we had access to citizenship, which is what most refugees did not, and which is a structural problem that leaves a lot of refugees sort of economically more disenfranchised than my family. And then, yes, as the book says, it was a story of gradual. You started the question by talking about East Amman and West Amman. So, for listeners who don't know the difference, East Amman is quite poor, and it's where a lot of the refugee communities have stayed. And West Amman is relatively affluent, and pockets of West Amman being more affluent than others. And so I traced that growth in the book in terms of going from what I would say was a low income or low middle class income family to a properly middle class or upper middle class income. I I I think Amman is one of these societies where there's quite an extreme level of inequality. I wouldn't put myself in upper class or wealthy because I've seen Jordanian wealth and our family is nowhere near that. So I'd say probably upper middle class. But yes, so by the time I came of age as an adolescent, I was very much someone who was in a middle class, upper middle class existence. And that's my relationship to Amman. And so that informs how the book is because I'm writing about my life. And so when I talk about things like Amman being a sterile place or Amman being not necessarily as political as, let's say, Beirut, that is taken to an extreme in my case because I think low-income communities and refugee communities in Amman are quite political and are active in organizing in ways that the affluent West Ammanis are not. But the silence that I'm grappling with as a kid in West Amman is the silence of my community, which is a community that's happy to sit in that affluence, even though it's coming at a cost, even though that it's coming at a cost, not only in terms of Palestine, but also in terms of the rest of the country and the rest of the people who are living in Jordan. And I think there aren't enough conversations about poverty in Jordan. And so I welcome this question. It's an important one. But in the context of the memoir, I'm simply reflecting my experience.
For sure. And I respect and honor that. And my goal was to make you a little bit uncomfortable as well. It wasn't to, I don't want to, throw you softballs only. But here's another one. I mean, you talk about, so you're a Christian. You and I know about the fault lines, sectarianism across the Arab world. We've talked about flavors of inferiority complex, but I can tell you that, there's a point where you and Ramzi are sitting and watching, I think, a group of men come out of a mosque, and you use the word superiority. We were superior, and that's in the context of being Christian. And I'm telling you that experience is felt. I felt it when I lived in Beirut. I felt it when I lived in Amman. Less personally, but it exists, and it exists in ties to the West in the way that, say, Christmas culture is supreme. And if you go to Amman today, it's almost strange. Or Dubai. The entire place is made up. It's Christmas. And I love Christmas. Christmas is wonderful. My wife, we celebrate Christmas. But you feel that inferiority as well, and you talk about it as superiority. So can you unpackage that as well? Because that's another flavor of complexity here.
Absolutely. I mean, I just to be clear, I don't talk about it as superiority. Ramzi is telling me, in that as children, that there is a sense of superiority, and it's something that sits uncomfortably with me, even before I had the language to understand why. And by the way, I think this is what queerness often does. One starts questioning these hegemonic or social narratives that one is exposed to because they understand that they're all conditional. But anyway, so there is this when one is writing a memoir, there is often the effort to polish, to make things look better than they are, to sort of hide some of the things that are um, disturbing. And I really wanted to avoid doing that because the point wasn't to represent society as best as it can be, but to represent society as it is. And our society does have these senses of sort of these subtle social differences between Christians and Muslims. That are often, as you say, related to this West. So, this idea that we're inferior, and anyone who's able to look to the West or has access to the West and Christians often are assumed to culturally because of their religion, then they're better. But also back to the question that you had just asked me, it's also a question of class. Christians in certainly Christian Palestinians, but also Christians in Jordan tend to be a higher economic class than Muslims, and so there's also a discomfort with class. So it's not just that quote unquote we're better because we're Christian. We're also better because we are actually better off. And so there's all of these things that shape some of these tensions. I say this a bit uncomfortably because at the same time, these tensions weren't necessarily ones that completely shaped my relation. Most of my friends at school were Muslim, and I didn't even real apart from the fact that I would go to Christian class and they would go to Muslim class. Our lives weren't really shaped by religion, but there is this undercurrent of understanding difference. You know, we drink, they don't. Our women are less conservatively dressed. Theirs are more conservatively. So there's always this us them, and it's something that's sort of just in the undercurrent of society. And I think it was important for me to reflect that because it's present, and I didn't want to turn a blind eye to it. Um, and I think it's all of these things. It's this sense of inferiority, this westernization, this class thing, and I think it's not just religion. Think about it in terms of language, that I'm writing this book in English. This is giving me access to the West that most people in Jordan don't have. Most people in Jordan would not, if they read at all, would not read this book because it's written in English. So there's already this sense of, an uncomfortable positionality, putting me slightly outside of this immediate context.
That's right. Um, so, I mean, you write at the end of the book that so you've gone through an exile. That's an important part of this story. In my interpretation, self-exiled. And it was a necessary distance you needed in order to interpret. But maybe that you weren't self-exiled. Maybe you were exiled from Ramzi's family, and that was an indication that the whole society is rejecting you. Um, but you've exiled. And then at the end of the book, you write, maybe writing this particular book will cause me to experience exile again. How do you evaluate that now? I mean, it's been out for less than a month, roughly. Hopefully, it'll be translated in Arabic. Will you be able to go back to Amman, to the Arab world?
I mean, I certainly hope so. I think that there are, I feel that this sort of sense of self-exile as a child was came from a place of not really understanding or having the capacity or the power to withstand the social judgment. And so I felt that I couldn't belong here. I need to leave. I'm now much wiser and much older, and I know that there is every right for me to belong, and that I'm certainly not the only queer individual in the region. There's a very vibrant movement even if it is oppressed and even if it is driven underground. But there is an openness if one knows where to look for it. And I think that our communities and our societies are able to have these conversations productively if prompted and if engaged with. In a particular way. I don't know how this will shape my coming sort of weeks, months, and years. But I'm confident that, this is certainly not the first book about queerness to come out from the region. I don't think it will be the last. I do think the book will come out in Arabic, at least it's my intention. And so we'll see. I think it's still something to be seen.
We don't have a ton of time, which is a shame. I always end up in this situation, but you are the authority. You've written the book on Hamas. And so I want to transition a little bit. Um, first question for you. What was it like to be a gay man in Gaza interviewing people in Hamas? And my perspective on Hamas is it's an indigenous movement, which happens to find its locus of identity on Palestinian Islamic nationalism. But it's inevitable in any kind of liberation struggle, the contours Hamas has taken. And that's not a values judgment, it's just an assessment. What was that experience like?
I mean, honestly, my queerness was irrelevant to that experience. It wasn't it's just like there are queer people in Gaza. I came into this place with a commitment to understanding it, to understanding Gaza, and to um, making, at least at the time of my writing, Hamas contained my role as a scholar and as an analyst was to completely remove myself from the equation. My goal was to go into Hamas's archives, to meet Hamas's leaders and individuals, and to portray their narrative as loyally and effectively as I could, because I felt and continue to feel that the movement is opportunistically misunderstood or misframed, certainly in the
Deliberately.
West,
Yeah.
deliberately, yes. And so I wanted to, and absented from media platforms and narratives. And so I felt that my role was to represent Hamas based on how Hamas views itself. And so I was in some ways a translator. My role was to absent myself from that equation. And so my queerness, like my every other aspect of my identity, was irrelevant to that equation. I was coming as an analyst and as a scholar looking to understand the movement.
Right. Uh, 2 years of genocide ongoing. Where's Palestine going? And I'm asking you as an analyst.
I mean, listen, I think we're in a very delicate and very painful time. We're talking a week after the UN issued its resolution to allow this international stabilization force and to legitimate the Trump peace plan. And I think that's a very dangerous precedent because it's basically taking a party that was complicit to genocide, which is the US, an active member of the genocide, which is the US, alongside Israel, and trying to create this reality where Palestinians are still not allowed self-determination and where there's absolutely no accountability for the fact that we just witnessed an apartheid regime carry out a genocide for 2 years with no recourse to any kind of justice. And I think Palestinians are still in this in the midst of living the horrors of genocide. There's discourse around the ceasefire, but there's no actual ceasefire. And so everything, as I read it at least, everything we're witnessing is this attempt to place us back into October 6th, to sort of pretend as if the past 2 years didn't happen, reinforce Israeli apartheid, bring in Western and even international legality in the form of the UN into these structures of occupation, into these structures of apartheid, and basically leave the regime of Israeli domination unchallenged. So I think it's a very troubling period. At the same time, um, at horrifying cost, with the shifts that we've seen in popular understanding of Palestine globally have been uh, unimaginable 2 years before, just in terms of understanding that we're not really talking about a peace process and two-state solution and partition. We're talking about genocide and colonialism and Nakba. And I think that shift is fundamental. I think it's a really important shift. I also think Zionism has shown itself to be a very weak ideology that is desperately in need of American support. So I think there's all of these things. There are, slivers of possible hope of understanding where, if we mobilize effectively, Palestinians can be quite strategic, and where there is enormous effort being put back in place to ensure that Israel is able to resuscitate its image post genocide, which I think is in some ways a futile effort on their part.
So at enormous and unjustifiable expense, we've seen the clock wound back to 1948 in
Yes,
the discussion. Israel is illegitimate, full stop, in my view, no qualifications. And that's always been my view. Zionism is racism. That's always been my view. And that seems to be a view which has gained more and more broad support through a genocide.
not
Nobody.
just broad support, but also, sorry to interrupt, but also among Palestinians, there's been a re-energization. I mean, you and I might have been active for years before the gen, but many Palestinians, certainly in the diaspora, hadn't been. And so there is this kind of resurgence, this going back to our revolutionary legacy, exactly what you said, understanding that Zionism is not an ideology that can be accommodated, that it must be dismantled in its entirety. So there is this resurgence in our movement that I think is very productive.
I agree fully. And then I look at our range of allies and they're normal and good people. Miss Rachel, that's somebody I want to hang out with, you know? So but I struggle with the asynchrony challenge. The fact that building political capital to use or building power to use the language of the DSA uh, is taking time and will take time. And yet, when I look at the map, when I look at the structural and material reality, it's hard for me to conclude anything other than the ethnic cleansing of Gaza is done. And I mean that over the course of the next few years, decade, whatever. And I don't blame anybody. I can't blame anybody. My family left Gaza. People are justified in going out and trying to live a life, trying to live a life wherever they can. How do you reconcile these two movements? I mean, do you think the analysis is correct? How do you reconcile the asynchrony challenge, the fact that in order to build political power, we may need decades even around this new understanding?
Yeah, this is the nihilism that I sit with every day. There's this sense of real despair, this sense of real urgency, the fact that we hadn't been able to stop a genocide. I mean, we can talk all we want to about these shifts that are happening in popular narratives, even some political victories that, like Mamdani's in New York. We can look at real ways in which Palestine has shaped and reshaped both popular and political realities in Palestine and globally. The reality is we haven't been able to stop a genocide. And this is something, there's a real sense of nihilism, which I share with you. At the same time, I understand that liberation struggles do not progress in linearity, that there are ebbs and flows, there are going forward and going backwards. Ultimately, if we look at the sort of the broad sort of scope of things, I think we understand that that for Palestinians at least, there's either extermination, as you say, full ethnic cleansing, and the Zionist project succeeds at achieving its goals in Palestine, or there's liberation. There's nothing in between. I think Palestinians had a 30-year gap, at least certainly on the level of the so-called leadership, of thinking that there can be accommodation, some kind of compromise, some kind of two-state solution. I think that's shattered, at least for most people. And we understand that this is an existential battle. It's either liberation or it's extermination. And on that scale, certainly there's sometimes despair and nihilism, but I also think that we have been so successful at maintaining our narrative, at continuing to mobilize. I mean, we've reshaped global politics in the past 2 years. And so they haven't won, which means we still have the capacity to win. And I think it's within our agency to figure out how to move forward from this. Um, and just the last point I want to make on this is it's also a question of power. I think sometimes we struggle to really talk about power, what it would mean for us to really grapple with power or hold power in a way that changes the balance of forces on the ground. Popular mobilization on its own is not enough. How do we build power? And that's what you're talking about. That's what takes time. And I think we don't have enough of these conversations. What does Palestinian power look like?
So, I mean, my final question to you then is, what does Palestinian power look like? I recently argued that we need broader than just a boycott of commercial. We need a cultural boycott. We need the total isolation of Zionists, full stop, everywhere. Um, I recognize that some people may be uncomfortable with that argument, but that's how I feel at this point. So, what does the next stage look like for you?
I mean, when I think about power, I mean it in ways that also transcend boycott, in the sense that, yes, I think it's important for us to boycott institutions and individuals that are complicit in apartheid and genocide, try to dismantle these structures, try to make them more egalitarian. But I think it's also important for us to think about alternative platforms and alternative structures that can help us develop power. For me, one of the biggest things in all of this is that, for decades, even before this genocide, even before Oslo, many Palestinians, certainly the Palestinian leadership, often look to the West. And in that way, reinforced the idea that the West is sort of central to our liberation and that our liberation is going to come through Western hegemony, which is a complete delusion because the West is responsible for our occupation to begin with. How do we shift our center of gravity away from the West and towards the majority of the rest of the world, many of whom are committed to us? How do we build more active solidarity with communities and with nation states that are in support of Palestinian liberation as we understand it, which is a free Palestine from the river to the sea, how do we think about Palestine within this context of global decolonization, not just sort of this seeking permission from the US or the EU in order to have a small state on a portion of our homeland? I think thinking about power is really thinking about sort of how we shift the balance of forces in these major ways globally, not just as it relates to Palestine. And I think in some ways that's a prerequisite for our liberation. I think our liberation and sort of these global questions go hand in hand.
A huge thank you to Tareq Baconi, the author of both Hamas Contained and the new book, Fire in Every Direction. I've really enjoyed our conversation, Tariq. I've learned so much. You're a very brave writer, and again, one of the sharpest analysts, I think, on Palestine today. So thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. I appreciate your time. Thank you.